Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. My name is Meagan Roy. I am the Director of Student Support Services here in Chittenden South Supervisory Union, and I am joined by Greg Marino, who's a principal in the Williston School District. And we're hoping to talk to you today about MTSS, or multi-tiered systems of support, which is really just the structures that schools use to support all of the learners that come their way. Before we jump into the things that we hope to cover today and some of the content, I actually just want you to read the quote on the screen, and I'll read it out loud as well, and just kind of react to it. If you are someone who likes to take notes, jot some notes down. But what this says is, success rests on a systemic approach that unifies general and special education in deliberate, intentional, ongoing collaboration to improve outcomes for all students. I'm going to pause for a second. And the reason we want to start with that quote is because I think it frames sort of how schools want to think about supporting all learners. We have lots of conversations about general education and special education, and really we're in the business of educating all students in a way that doesn't draw a line between different parts of our schools. And so we really want you to have that context as you listen to us talk a little bit about MTSS. So hopefully we will do two things today. First, we will give you a sense of what is MTSS, what are the structures, what are the components, and how do they support all of the learners to be successful in school. And then we want to walk you through the experience of a student and a family in this process, and sort of talk about what they might experience. And as the intro said, please feel free to ask questions. We might pause and answer your questions, or we might save them because they might be covered later in the presentation.
Good morning. As Megan said, my name is Greg Marino. I'm the district principal at Williston School District. Pleased to be here with you this morning. So on the first slide, Megan, that quote that was shared, a big part of what MTSS is that word system. It really is a cohesive and coherent collection of practices that work together. And they can't be haphazard, but they have to really fit together to create a tight weave. Essentially, MTSS is everything a school does with its approach to teaching students to make sure that every student has their best chance to succeed. So there's a lot involved with that. There's an intricate network of pieces that fit together to create that weave. And when everything's working correctly, all those threads are synchronized. They're, again, cohesive, and they create this really tight system underneath every child that helps that system make sure that every child has the best chance for success. So this is an image, this pyramid image, that's been around for probably at least 15 years or so. Some of you may be familiar with it. And essentially, the triangle image is meant to show a few things. Essentially, as you move up the triangle, we're looking at a higher intensity of supports that may be delivered for students that have fragility or, fragile areas of learning. The triangle is widest at the base because that's where most students are. That is core instruction, what all students get. And then with a good MTSS systems, we're identifying early students who need a little bit more, and those students are given a little bit more, and then that intervention is monitored, and we make the steps about what happens next. So in terms of this triangle, certain students would move up the triangle slightly. Well, these students need a little bit more than what everybody's getting. And then when we monitor those interventions, we might decide some of those students need even more than that. What are we going to do differently because this student isn't getting the outcomes that we'd expect based on what we're doing? So we refine and target those interventions even more. But because those numbers of students get fewer and fewer, we get the triangle narrowing as we go up. Again, so the intensity of supports are increasing as the triangle goes up, and we have fewer and fewer students. But essentially, though, if you look to the left of the slide, you've got up top really intensive individualized interventions. In the middle, targeted supplemental interventions, and at the bottom, what everybody's getting. Really solid, good core instruction in the classroom. In recent days and months, and I don't know if years is fair, but I guess we're moving away from this idea of the triangle. It's still a useful image at times, but we're thinking less and less about a tiered approach and more about an integrated model where high-quality instruction, a comprehensive assessment system, robust professional learning, and effective collaboration all are woven together to create a systemic, comprehensive approach. And that's really what we're focused on. How do we create that tight weave under all students?
In the resource document that you'll get later when slides are sent out, and it's actually the last slide in this presentation, we have a link to a couple of things that we think are important for folks to have if you're not familiar with them already. Both of them are from the Vermont MTSS Field Guide. So a number of years ago, Vermont pulled together a really broad stakeholder group that included educators in general and special ed, administrators, families, community partners, people from higher education, to really talk about what does Vermont believe related to instruction and multi-tiered systems of support. Those are really seminal documents about MTSS. So if you're not familiar with them, take a look. There's a lot of information in them. And we have two things. The first link is a list of the guiding principles that sort of underpin Vermont's approach to MTSS. And as we go through each of the components, we're going to highlight specific guiding principles as they make sense. And again, we think these are really important steering documents and help understand, maybe why Vermont takes the approach that they take around MTSS. So the next few slides are going to be a lot of content. So what we're hoping to do is paint a picture of those 5 components that Greg just talked about and how they were woven together. What do each of them mean? There's a guiding principle that we think is really important, and I'll read it. It's not on your slide. It says, dynamic, positive, and productive collaboration among students, families, and professionals with relevant expertise is the foundation for effective problem solving and instructional decision making within a multi-tiered system. And I think that's really important to show, collaboration is here as a component. None of these components is more important than any of the other. They really need to function together. So first, we've talked about this a little bit, but what we know about how schools work is that when we improve and change, that's really effective when we do it systematically, and that's how change becomes sustainable. So there might be individual schools within a system or classrooms within a school doing really innovative and great instruction for kids, but if they're not part of a really system-wide approach, it's going to be difficult for them to sustain that change. So this component is really a foundational one, and is what keeps all of the other components together and what helps ensure that schools can make this successful. The second component is effective collaboration. And for us, what we think is important is not just that we have structures in place to allow us to collaborate, but that our school really builds a collaborative culture. Meeting the needs of all learners and identifying kids who are struggling and then deciding what needs to be brought to that student to help support them really requires collaboration. It requires collaboration at the teacher level so that teachers can access colleagues and access expertise in the district to help bring intervention to a student. It also requires collaboration with families so that at the earliest sign of when a student is struggling, that families are aware of that and can be involved with things that can be worked on at home. They're involved with the decision-making process so that so they're aware, as the teachers are, about what's being tried, how we're measuring it, and it's really important to build that culture from the very beginning. The next component is high-quality instruction and intervention, and you know, MTSS uses a lot of language that we use the word intervention a lot, and sometimes we use the words tiers, which is can be referred to as another step of increasingly intense intervention. But even when you're intervening with a student or providing specialized instruction, you're providing instruction, and whether you're receiving that in your classroom or with an additional resource that comes and supports a student, all of it needs to be very high quality. So what do we know? We know that high quality instruction is provided by knowledgeable teachers. We know that teachers balance what they know about the research in instruction and also respond to what the student is telling them at the time, either literally or through the data that they're gathering. And this is an important distinction. It's really critical for teachers to have an understanding of what research tells us, but it's also really critical that they know how to respond to what the student is doing in the moment and how to adjust that instruction. Good instruction is differentiated, meaning we learn a lot about the kids that we're working with, either individually or as a whole group, and we adjust what we're doing with those students based on where they are. We also provide instruction, and we also make sure that kids are able to access that instruction. People talk a lot about when do we work on the skills that help kids access instruction, and I think we would say that they're equally important to what you're doing with the student in the moment. And we have to be really responsive to the needs of diverse learners.
So the next component is about a comprehensive and balanced assessment system. And an assessment system is really central in an effective multi-tiered system of support. Teachers and any providers of instruction really need to be analytic practitioners and be constantly tuned in to what students are doing. And the balanced assessment system helps them do that. Well-designed balanced assessment system includes tools and processes that are effective to address all sorts of assessment purposes. So assessment happens constantly. Just like as we're walking through our day, we're taking in information and making decisions on a moment-to-moment basis based on what we're taking in, which way we turn, where we park our car. Teachers are doing that on a minute-to-minute basis based on assessments and information they're taking in from their students. So assessments can drive planning. You can use an assessment to support instruction. An assessment can be a monitoring tool. We'll talk more about that later, but essentially we know a student is working on a particular skill or set of skills, and we need an assessment that we're going to be able to monitor the development of that skill as we're instructing it. And then an assessment verifies learning. So does the student have mastery over this or not? So, so assessments are happening really at every part of the learning process. And then, of course, we have those bigger assessments, sometimes called summatives, where teachers deliver at the end of a unit. Or a summative assessment could be even at the mid-year or end of year, where you're taking a larger body of information and asking, do we have verification of learning? Do the students know what we hope they know? But at that point, really it's too late to respond and say, well, what am I going to do differently as a teacher? Because it is an end point, a summative. So that's why the most important assessments are the ones that we're doing every day. Investigating the cause of learning difficulties. So assessments can also be diagnostic in nature. We can use certain assessments, and these assessments need to be part of the system to learn more about how a child does their best learning, where a child is struggling, what we can do differently to help that child be successful in their learning. All of these assessments need to be in a system that is organized, that makes sense. If every teacher had their own collection of assessments, it would be very difficult as a system to get together and have intelligent conversations about supporting students and using that assessment data to inform next steps. So that system of assessment needs to be cohesive across the system so everyone knows what they're talking about when you're looking at the assessment results. So this next component, expertise. So with instruction, with teaching, we're in a field like other fields. We're really never done learning. We have to have the mindset as educators that every day we need to be doing better than we were yesterday, and we need to constantly be looking at our expertise in our instruction. So that's where the school-wide collaborative professional learning is a critical factor in increasing student achievement. And I want to use the word mindset again. Meagan talked earlier about a culture of collaboration. There also needs to be a culture of continuous professional learning, a mindset where professionals just kind of own the idea that this is something I'm never done with. And you know, one of the things the field guide speaks to here is that professional development models that are embedded as part of a teacher's experience in a school system have the best chance of improving and sustaining professional practice. And what that means is that a teacher who works in a particular school system won't miss out. They don't have to sign up for something extra that happens off-site or where they'll go to a conference. Those things happen, and those things are great, and those are value added for all teachers. But that there are opportunities as part of that teacher's work responsibilities. So there's a regular opportunity for that teacher to engage in professional collaboration and professional learning. It's part of what they do, so everyone experiences it. And this is, again, just a reminder. Look back at this image and just a reminder that there's a systemic approach and that all 5 of these things are working together. High quality instruction, comprehensive assessment system, a professional learning culture, effective collaboration, and those things come together to create that tight weave. So at this point, we're going to offer up a few questions and just pause for a few moments to allow time for people to put some thoughts together and allow a few questions to populate. Okay, so just think about these 5 components and see if you have any questions about the particular components. And then think more about your personal experiences and what experiences you may have had with these particular components in your child's school system. And we'll just pause for a few minutes to allow some questions to gather.
So we're going to start answering a couple of the questions. Feel free to keep them coming through, and hopefully you can still kind of reflect as we're answering. But there's a really good question around how kind of where does special education fall in a multi-tiered system of support? And I think part of the reasons why we started with the quote is in a multi-tiered system of support, special education is part of that. And I'll answer it in a couple of different ways. I'm going to go back in the slides a little bit. And when you are assessing a student, and some of this will also make sense when Greg is walking us through the experience of a student. It's a little harder than I thought to go backwards in these slides. Going back to the pyramid. So when students are receiving instruction in the classroom, it's of very high quality, the teacher is differentiating, but they're measuring, and students not quite where they want them to be, so they're providing some of these targeted and supplemental interventions, and they're measuring it, and they're deciding whether or not the student's responding to those interventions. If their student isn't progressing still, despite those interventions, the way that the team would like, then we keep going through this loop. And we say, okay, maybe we need to adjust the intervention. Maybe we need to bring an additional resource in, some additional expertise. Maybe we need to do this more frequently. What increases as you kind of move up in this process is the intensity of your intervention. As you keep going, though, and kids continually aren't demonstrating the response to those interventions that we want them to, a team starts asking themselves, is there other information that we need to gather that will help us know how this student learns? And Greg talks about the diagnostic element of an assessment system. Special education evaluation often comes into conversation at that point, because what a team is asking itself is there something else going on that's interfering with the student's ability to respond to all of these supports being brought to bear? And in a really solid system, there shouldn't be a hard line in between special education and the interventions that they're receiving. But it is a part of education that has very specific regulations and rules and processes that govern it. But that's the point at which you start to talk about special education. I think we want to be careful and make sure people know that if you're looking at the triangle, it isn't a hard line. That's why the colors in the triangle are blended, and quite honestly, it's why we prefer this more circular visual that's here, because really the conversations are just continuing as you move up. And there is a point at which, though, a student might need something more explicit, more specialized. And then related to that question, there's a question about how families understand assessments that are happening to their students. And ideally, parents are made aware through ongoing communication with their child's teacher when they're not achieving where the teacher would like them to be. And that's very early on in the process, sometimes before those assessments are even given, or it may be just as the teacher's giving some formative classroom-based assessments and are just seeing things that they have concern about. That's when the family should be brought into the conversation. The point at which a team is wanting to do some assessments with a student that aren't given to all students, that's actually a point where the family has to be involved to help to give permission for those assessments, but ideally that assessment information is shared really early on in the process. I'm going to stick on this slide actually for a second and pass this to Greg to field the next question.
So there's a question about assessment. I'm just going to read the question straight out. The asker asks, I am confused about formative and summative assessments. I thought they test the exact same thing in different ways, but because the summative after the fact when a student reaches mastery on it. Your description of a summative sounds like the old system of a test at the end and move on whether mastery has been achieved or not. So it's a great question about the difference between formative and summative assessments, and I agree with the asker that a summative and a formative can look similar, and in fact a formative assessment should include the information that's going to eventually appear again on a summative, because the purpose of a formative assessment, and really the difference is the timing of the assessment and the frequency of the assessment and the purpose of the assessment. The purpose of a formative assessment is their ongoing dipsticks, if you will, ongoing check-ins from the instructor with the student about how is this student achieving the learning. Are they grasping the concepts as we move day through day, week through week? So that when the summative is given, there really shouldn't be any surprises for that instructor, or really if the instruction is responsive and transparent to the student, there shouldn't be any surprises for the student either. There is also that type of summative that's a little bit more of the old school summative, where students are given a chance to show what they know with a larger body of knowledge. And if formatives haven't happened prior to that, that's not an ideal system, and that's not what you'd want in a comprehensive MTSS system, because then really it could be a surprise to the student, it could be a surprise to the instructor of what exactly the student had mastery on and what they didn't. So that's kind of a non-example of a solid MTSS system. The purpose of the formatives are to help build in transparency for the student and to help the teacher really stay on target with their adjustments to the instruction. Hope that addresses that question.
Okay, there's another question that says, in your experience, how long might it take a team to determine that a student was not responding to instruction and refer for an evaluation? It's a really good and really common question. And like many things in how we understand MTSS now, there's no right answer, or there's no single answer to that question, because the key is team is wrapping around a student, they're measuring where the student is, and they're intervening. And along the way, depending on what skill the student's working on, 2 weeks of intervention might be enough time to know whether or not it's working. For other skills, you might need 6 weeks, or you might need 8 weeks. All along the way, though, this is where the communication and the collaboration start to become really key to the conversation, because as a family, if my child is, I know they're receiving some intervention, I know what skill they're working on, but if I don't really know what's happening and 3 or 4 weeks has gone by, or 6 or 8 weeks, or that can be 2 months of the school year. That feels like a long time, but it might be the exact right amount of time. The key is whether I'm aware of what the team is doing to gather the data, review the data, and see progress. And if they're seeing progress, are they communicating that process with the family? Because in some cases, what's happening during what appears to be a long amount of time is that the student's gaining skill and accelerating and getting closer to where they want, where we want the student to be. And there's a really good reason why we have a certain amount of time. What we don't want is students that are sort of flagged very early on in the year, and we come back together at the end of the year and realize that not a whole lot has happened, and the trajectory is pretty flat. So it's a question that doesn't have a really hard and fast answer, but the communication is key, and how we're using the assessment information that we have about the student to respond. I'm going to answer one more question, and then I think we'll move on, because I suspect that even some of these answers will start to be fleshed out a little bit more when we talk about a student experience. But this last question is sharing how MTSS for behavior fits in with MTSS for academics. One of the things that we didn't frame actually is that MTSS is really about every piece of learning that a student does in school, whether it is behavior or whether it is academics. And so again, that recursive problem-solving model, if a student is in the classroom and they're struggling behaviorally, hopefully that school has a system of universal instruction around social emotional skills that all students have access to. It might be responsive classroom. There's many different ways that we teach appropriate behavior. But what happens in an MTSS is a student, whether by referrals to the office, if you're in a PBIS system, positive behavior intervention and support, the team is, again, looking at the information. Is the student somehow not responding to that universal social emotional instruction that happens in the classroom? And if so, do they need some intervention? So the intervention is provided, it's measured, we decide whether or not there's sufficient progress, and it's essentially the exact same process. But it does require, as we've talked about, it requires a structure, a systemic approach to know what are the skills that we expect students to learn, how are we instructing them to all learners, and then what's our system of supports as students may need intervention in those areas, because they really are connected. It's impossible to pull them apart. Okay, so I'm going to pass this to Greg again, and hopefully we are going to talk a little bit about what this might look like as a student or as a family going through the process.
Thank you, Megan. At this time, I ask you, okay, just going to ask you to prepare your eyes for a busy slide. That comes next. So I'd actually like to ask you to just take a few minutes or a few seconds to look at this image and maybe jot down anything that occurs to you as you look at this. So this is a real important part of MTSS system. It really points to responsive instruction. And this is a continuous cycle that should be happening at all points throughout the system and the process. We're getting some information that people are having trouble here. Okay. So this, hopefully that's corrected. So this responsive instruction loop is continuous and should always be in motion at any point through the system. And if you look at it, zoom in on it as a one instructor lens, the person instructing is delivering that teaching and working with the student, collecting assessment information, that formative assessment that we talked about earlier, looking at that information, reflecting on it, providing feedback to the student, so there's that transparency, and then making adjustments. So based on what I'm seeing the student understanding and my own instruction, I'm going to give this feedback to the students, and then I'm going to adjust my instruction and deliver it again. But it doesn't end there. That cycle is continuous. And that cycle happens with a whole classroom instruction, but then it also happens with small group and individual instruction. So now you can prepare your eyes for a little bit of a busy slide. Just bear with me as I attempt to help you make sense of this. And I'm going to just use the cursor here to point out some things as I'm talking. But hopefully you recognize right away, up here in the upper left, there's that responsive teaching cycle. And I want you to imagine, if you will, that cycle being overlaid to this trajectory. And although this is a linear representation, and to some extent it parallels the triangle idea, that as we move along this arrow, the intensity of interventions is growing. Think cyclical too, because this cycle of responsive instruction should be happening at every point along this trajectory. Another important part I want to point out is this piece around parent engagement and parent and family engagement, that as much as possible there should be a level of transparency between what's going on with the learning and at home, so that families are engaged, families have understanding of how their child is doing, so family has to have a basic understanding of what's being instructed, and so families can connect with students, connect with teachers, and engage in the process. Because we know that when families are engaged and families are connected and involved, that's an important part of helping all students do their best work. So I'm going to ask to bring your attention to the lower left-hand corner of the screen, and that's really where we get down to that. Let's see, we've got a little, continue, okay. That's where, if we think about that triangle, and at the bottom of the base of that triangle, where there's good, solid first instruction for every student in the classroom. So we know that most students are going to respond to this really expert instruction delivered by highly qualified teachers. We need to know, though, is at the earliest possible time, who are the students who might be struggling with that good instruction. So even though everybody's getting solid Tier 1 instruction, we'll call it, there are some students who might need a little bit more. So based on our assessment system, the teacher will have tools to know, okay, these three students are fragile in this area of learning. Based on this assessment I just administered, I'm going to make some adjustments to my classroom instruction. There's also a more system level example of this, and that's called a data review, where teams of teachers get together on a regular basis, and usually you have classroom instructors, intervention providers, special educators, possibly an administrator, school counselor in the room, and you look at grade level data on a common assessment, and you say, okay, based on this data we're looking at, based on this assessment, these particular students are presenting as being fragile in a particular area. So what are we going to do differently about what we do? We're going to adjust our classroom instruction. After that, it's our responsibility to monitor the progress. So this progress monitoring, you'll see it appears here, you'll see it appears here, but essentially if we think back to that comprehensive assessment system, it should be happening all the time. So we've made adjustments to classroom instruction, we're monitoring the progress of how students are doing, and then we're looking to say, we're asking the question, are the expected results happening? Based on the adjustments we made to instruction, and based on the assessments now that we're looking at, have the students responded as we would expect them to? So if yes, great. Those students may be able to discontinue that little extra that they were getting in the classroom, or the teacher will adjust accordingly. If not, then here's a decision point in a system that could happen. And in some schools, this is where an EST team would gather and look at a student and say, okay, here's a student that presented fragile in the area of, let's say, reading, and we made these adjustments to instruction, and we monitored, and we adjusted again, and we monitored, but we're not seeing the expected results. So let's get more targeted with our interventions, and let's get more intense with our interventions. So that might mean smaller group. That might even mean some one-on-one instruction here and there. It might mean more frequency. So in addition to good classroom instruction, this student is going to get extra instruction 3 or 4 or 5 times a week. and it's going to be delivered by an expert instructor. So this may result here where it says, where you see this decision point, EST in parentheses. EST stands for Educational Support Team, and every school has an educational support team as part of their MTSS system, and that's actually required by state statute. So as a result of that educational support team coming together, an EST plan is formed, and that plan is essentially a plan for that student. It identifies the area of challenge, and it identifies the exact interventions that are going to be delivered. And a good EST plan will tell you, okay, this is how we're going to measure whether the students, well, first, really, let me back up for a second, excuse me. Good EST plan will say, these are the goals. 4 to 6 to 8 weeks from now, we expect the student will be doing this. And to help them get there, we're going to provide these specific interventions, and to know whether we'll get there or not, we're going to use these particular assessments. And all that's laid out in the plan. Then those targeted interventions are delivered to the student. Now this might be a good point to say, this is not instead of good instruction in the classroom. This is in addition to good instruction in the classroom. So that really robust, solid Tier 1 classroom instruction that all students are getting, we really mean all students. This is in addition to that. So these targeted interventions are delivered and they're monitored. And remember, the EST plan spells out how they're going to be monitored. And that EST team comes back together, whether it's a formal meeting or whether it's the teacher tracking that plan, to look at whether the expected results are achieved. Now if you think about a rotating cycle, this could happen repeatedly, where a team can say, okay, the expected results aren't being achieved here. This is what we're going to do differently, and we're going to come back to the table 6 weeks from now and talk about it again. And so that could happen 2 or 3 times. And here we are again, if we're doing those things and we're not seeing expected results, that's when we could have another decision point. And as Meagan spoke to earlier, that's where we could enter the realm of using some more diagnostic assessments and be thinking about the realm of special education and whether there may be the presence of a disability or something else that's getting in the way of the student's learning. So I hope that helped to make some sense of this fairly busy slide.
Okay. So before we kind of open it up for questions, we did want to bring you back to this quote again, and I won't read it to you a second time, but as you kind of reflect on what you've learned, does this make more sense to you now? Does it pose more questions? And just sort of think about how MTSS unifies our system so that special education is not, as it once was, the only way that students can receive additional support. And in fact, there's a broad array of supports, including special education, that are available to learners in our system. So at this point, we want to pause again and ask if there are any other questions or comments. And let's see. So we have a question about what we use for tracking systems. And it's a really good question. It's actually a question that our system has wrestled with. And I would answer it a couple of different ways. I'm guessing the question is, how do we warehouse our data? How do we keep track of the pieces of our assessment system that are common to all learners? The first thing that I would say is, as we move to a system that is proficiency-based and we start talking about what proficiency-based learning looks like, and we rely more heavily on formative assessment in the classroom, that changes conversations a little bit about data warehousing, because formative assessment probably looks, if there's 4 fourth grade classrooms, the formative assessment might look slightly different in all 4 of those classrooms. The learning targets are probably similar. What we want kids to learn is similar, but how a teacher is assessing it is different. And we want to make sure that when we select a tracking system, that we don't forget that those formative assessments probably aren't going to get entered in that tracking system. And how do we make sure that we still put adequate weight on the system, on the formative assessment that we're gathering? That said, our system uses VCAT, which is a Vermont-grown company, to house common assessments. So we give the Fontes and Pinnell for our younger grade students. It'll house that data. It houses statewide assessment data, and houses, in our district, houses our EST system, or soon will. There are other systems out there, and I think the important thing for schools to do is how does whatever system you're using interface with the other pieces of technology that you have in your system? How do you make sure that teachers know how to use it and know how to not just access and enter the data, but really engage with the data? Because entering data isn't sufficient. Collecting it isn't sufficient. It's really about how you use it. And then we're really trying to understand better how we make sure we still use formative assessment, that information that teachers are gathering all the time. So I'm going to read the next question because it's a really important one that comes up a lot. So families of children with disabilities may feel uneasy when thinking about MTSS. It took many years of advocacy for IDEA and special education. They worry about special ed being watered down and eventually done away with in favor of one big system. I would say that what special education is part of your MTSS, but when a student enters special education, there's an acknowledgement that there is the presence of a disability, and all those years of advocacy around gathering protections for those students come into play. Special education should be providing services that are not available to the rest of the students in the system, and that is a distinction. And even though I believe very strongly, and I think in our system we believe that general and special education should be unified. Special education shouldn't feel like a different place or a different person that you go see, but it is a different set of resources that isn't available to all learners. So if we do this well, special education isn't watered down. It's actually more targeted, more intensive, more expert based on what a student's disability is. And I don't really envision special education going away, but I do envision our systems becoming more unified, becoming more flexible, so that if a special educator has an expertise that a student who's not eligible needs, that student can access it. And I think if we do that well, it won't be watered down. And I also think that a key to kind of calming that fear, which is very real, is that collaboration and that communication with families. The last thing a family wants to hear is that we're waiting for something. In an MTSS, there is no waiting. It's ongoing, active engagement. So there's a question that I'm going to stick with. It's, can you speak to your experiences with cost increases and cost shifting as a result of implementing MTSS? I think that our funding system right now, and many of us wish that it weren't this way, but our funding system does create a structure where special education is funded differently. And our funding model is based on reimbursement, which means if students are eligible for special education, we get state reimbursement for the services that we're providing. I think that there has a belief, I hope it's a belief that's going away, but I'm not sure, that that there is a push that whether or not to identify students has more to do with where our money comes from than it does with what a student needs. And I think our funding structure causes that to a certain extent. Meaning, in some systems, a school really wants to be able to get reimbursement for services, and so they're going to identify more students. And in another system, who has a really robust MTSS and isn't so concerned with reimbursement, might identify fewer students. Until our funding system isn't based on reimbursement, that may continue to happen, but I would say that in what I observe is that we're moving away from that, and people are really just having conversations about what does the student need, what's the resource in our building that we have available to bring to that student. If that resource is in special education, I think there are ways to be flexible to a point so that we can bring that resource to bear, and many schools have a much more robust non-special education support. And so you know, if we get to a point where our system is unified, there really isn't any cost shift to one part or the other. That probably doesn't fully answer that question. It's a good one, and it's a complexity that we think about, but what we strive to do is focus on what the student needs, what resources are available in the building, and how do we bring them to that student. So it doesn't look like there are any other questions. So there in the slide, there is one more question. We'll get to it in a second. But I did want to highlight that in the slides, if you have access to them later, there are links to the field guide and also a link to just a handout about the guiding principles for MTSS. And I think if you read those guiding principles, some of the fears that came out in the questions, you'll see at least Vermont's philosophical standpoint around those pieces, and I think that that can be really important. So there is a question here about should we expect to see more co-teaching as a result of MTSS implementation. In our system, we talk a lot about what we call an embedded special education model, or really just an embedded intervention model. And to us, that means that there is a often a special educator or a licensed intervention teacher part of our core teaching teams. Sometimes they are co-teaching, meaning in the classroom at the same time. Other times they're just co-planning, but the key is that that group of teachers, the general ed teachers and that intervention professional, are collectively responsible for meeting the needs of all of the kids in their classroom. That is a much broader understanding than just co-teaching, but co-teaching falls into that. And we think that broader understanding is part of what allows us, going back to the question about cost shifts, that's what allows us to not even have to have that conversation, because we have a model that brings a professional level resource to schools. And that's something that we're really interested in and we want to further. So that may be yes to the answer to that question, but I think it's broader than just co-teaching. And since we're at the end, I'll just say thanks for joining us for today's webinar. You can visit VFN's website at vermontfamilynetwork.org for helpful resources, upcoming webinars, and other workshops and events. This webinar will be archived along with all of our other webinars and can be viewed on Vermont Family Network's YouTube channel. If you'd like to talk with someone at VFN, please call 1-800-800-405. Have a good day.